The silence of a server room is usually broken only by the soft hum of machines. But on that morning, across several African capitals, that hum shifted into something else entirely: a roar of sovereignty. Microsoft's vast cloud empire, once thought untouchable, suddenly found itself collapsing in the very region it had quietly dominated for years. For decades, Africa's data, the emails, contracts, government archives, even medical records flowed through servers managed not in Ouagadougou, not in Nairobi, not in Johannesburg, but in data centers owned by giants thousands of miles away. Microsoft Azure was the crown jewel of this arrangement, holding more than 70% of Africa's cloud services. To many, it looked permanent, unshakable, inevitable, until it wasn't. Out of the Sahel and into the Southern Cone, African nations stood together to launch their own digital backbone. Overnight contracts worth tens of billions evaporated from Microsoft's balance sheet. This was not just about servers and storage. It was about who owns the keys to the future. For the first time, Africa declared, our data will no longer be someone else's colony. The world didn't see it coming. Not Washington, not Brussels, not even Wall Street analysts who spend every day forecasting risk. And yet here it was, a continental strike against the very heart of Silicon Valley's power. So the question for us today is simple but profound. Was this merely a financial blow to Microsoft or the beginning of Africa's true digital independence? Can leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré turn this moment into a lasting revolution, or will the empire strike back harder than ever? Stay with us, because in the next few minutes we'll dive into how Africa just crashed Microsoft's cloud empire and why the aftershocks will be felt not only in Africa but across every home office and government on the planet. Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to witness President Ibrahim Traoré's vision unfolding, and subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. The story begins not in Silicon Valley but in Africa's own corridors of decision-making. For years, Microsoft's Azure platform was the silent giant behind countless transactions across the continent. Government payrolls, banking systems, education networks, even health ministries, all tethered to servers branded with the familiar Windows logo. To outsiders, it was proof of progress. Africa, they said, was finally catching up by plugging itself into the world's digital economy. But beneath the surface, frustration was building. Leaders knew that while African citizens were generating the data, the ownership and profits flowed elsewhere. A school in Burkina Faso storing test scores, a hospital in Lagos archiving patient records, a ministry in Nairobi filing energy contracts, all of it fed into an empire headquartered thousands of miles away. This dependency was not just technological, it was political. Whoever controlled the data controlled the decisions. The turning point came when a coalition of nations, including Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, South Africa, and Kenya, quietly began developing their own continental cloud system. For 2 years, under the radar, teams of young engineers, state-backed investors, and military cyber units worked on building what they called AfroCloud, a homegrown distributed network of data centers powered by renewable energy and hardened against foreign surveillance. When the project was finally unveiled, it wasn't a slow rollout, it was a shockwave. At a press conference in Addis Ababa, the African Union's Technology Commission announced that all member states had the option to migrate government and enterprise data immediately to AfroCloud free of charge for the first year. That single announcement set off a chain reaction. Within days, ministries from Mali to Mozambique were signing transfer contracts. Banks in Johannesburg and Abidjan shifted their servers. Telecommunications companies began rerouting customer data. And perhaps most symbolically, Burkina Faso's transitional president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, ordered that every government record from military communications to school exam archives be transferred into AfroCloud within 90 days. For Microsoft, the blow was staggering. Overnight, more than $30 billion in contracts either froze or were canceled outright. Servers in Nairobi and Johannesburg, once humming with Azure's signature blue dashboards, went dark as African technicians disconnected them and rebooted under AfroCloud's new interface. What was once a steady stream of profits for Redmond headquarters turned into a vacuum. The global financial markets took notice. Microsoft's stock dipped sharply, losing nearly $70 billion in market value within 48 hours. Analysts scrambled to understand how they had missed the signs. Africa is not a priority market, one Wall Street report had concluded just weeks earlier. But in reality, Africa had been quietly preparing its own digital independence, and no one outside saw it coming. The symbolism was powerful. For decades, Africa's revolutions were waged with rifles protests and political manifestos. This time, the battlefield was invisible fiber optic cables, data packets, server farms, and the victory was measured in terabytes, not territory. Ordinary citizens began to feel the shift too. Small businesses reported lower costs when migrating their e-commerce operations onto AfroCloud. Universities announced partnerships to give students access to secure African-based cloud storage. Even musicians and filmmakers long frustrated by licensing systems tied to foreign servers found new opportunities to protect their intellectual property at home. Still, the event was not just about economics or convenience. It was about control. For the first time, an African-made system dictated where the continent's knowledge, culture, and future would reside. And for Microsoft, a company that had once been celebrated for bringing Africa online, the irony was brutal. The very market it helped cultivate had now turned against it. The first act of this drama closed with a single unforgettable image, a server room in Ouagadougou, its racks glowing not with Microsoft's familiar logos, but with AfroCloud's new insignia, an outline of the African continent lit in green, gold, and red. It was a declaration without words. Africa's digital sovereignty had arrived. If the launch of AfroCloud shook the ground beneath Microsoft, the next 48 hours brought the real earthquake. What began as a regional announcement quickly turned into a global spectacle. The climax came during a late-night broadcast from Ouagadougou, where Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a wall of servers glowing with the green, gold, and red insignia of AfroCloud. His words cut through the air like a drumbeat. Africa's data will no longer be a Western colony. From today, the keys to our digital house belong to us, and to us alone. Those words ricocheted around the world. Within minutes, international newsrooms scrambled to push out breaking alerts. Reuters described it as a digital coup against Microsoft. Bloomberg called it the most significant technology realignment since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And CNN's anchor, visibly astonished, asked the question on millions of minds: how did the world not see this coming? The stock market answered with brutal clarity. Microsoft shares plummeted, wiping out $70 billion in market value by the close of trading. In Silicon Valley, tech executives convened emergency board meetings. At Microsoft headquarters in Redmond, Washington, CEO Satya Nadella reportedly held back-to-back calls with U.S. officials describing the loss as unprecedented in scale and speed. Governments in the West were no less alarmed. In Washington, a senior State Department official described AfroCloud as a national security concern, warning that sensitive diplomatic and defense information could now be locked behind African firewalls. In Brussels, the European Commission issued a statement urging dialogue but also hinting at economic retaliation if European companies were shut out of Africa's digital economy. Meanwhile, in Beijing and Moscow, the reaction was celebratory. Chinese state media praised AfroCloud as the birth of a multipolar internet, while Russia hailed it as a victory against digital colonialism. Offers of technical and financial assistance began pouring in, further unsettling Western capitals. But perhaps the most dramatic response came not from boardrooms or parliaments, but from the streets. Across African cities, spontaneous celebrations erupted. In Bamako, young people marched with banners reading, "Our data, our future." In Johannesburg, students gathered outside universities chanting Traoré's words, "No longer a colony." Social media exploded with hashtags like Yam Digital Independence and Buy Microsoft trending worldwide within hours. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Just as earlier generations celebrated independence from colonial powers with flags and anthems, this generation celebrated independence with firewalls and server racks. The climax was not merely political theater, it was a collective catharsis. Yet with celebration came unease. Journalists asked whether AfroCloud could withstand the inevitable backlash. Would Western corporations attempt to sabotage it? Would sanctions choke off its growth? Skeptics warned that Africa's infrastructure, though improving, still faced power shortages, limited connectivity in rural areas, and the constant threat of cyber attacks. Still, the momentum was undeniable. Tech entrepreneurs who had long struggled under the weight of foreign licensing fees suddenly saw a new dawn. Startups in Nairobi spoke of expanding without fear of sudden price hikes from U.S. providers. Farmers in Ghana, using digital platforms to monitor crops, expressed relief that their data would no longer leave the continent. Even religious leaders framed the moment in spiritual terms, declaring AfroCloud a gift of liberation. For Microsoft, the humiliation was sharp. After years of branding itself as Africa's partner, the company was cast overnight as a symbol of dependency and control. Leaked memos revealed executives debating whether to launch legal challenges at the World Trade Organization or to pursue back-channel negotiations with African leaders. But the political winds had shifted. AfroCloud was no longer a proposal, it was a reality. The climax of this saga was best captured in one haunting image: global news cameras zooming in on a server room in Addis Ababa where technicians unplugged the last remaining Azure server rack from the African Union headquarters. The lights blinked out. Then, almost ceremonially, a new line of AfroCloud servers flickered to life. Applause erupted in the control room. Outside, the sound of fireworks lit up the night sky. In that moment, the world finally understood Africa had not just crashed Microsoft's empire, it had announced its own. The shockwaves of AfroCloud's rise did not remain confined to corporate boardrooms or diplomatic corridors. They rippled into the everyday lives of millions across the continent, reshaping both civil society and political landscapes in ways no one could ignore. On the civilian front, the most immediate impact was access. For decades, small businesses had complained about the high costs of storing data on foreign servers where prices were set by distant corporations with little regard for African realities. Suddenly, with AfroCloud's launch, those fees plummeted. A tailor in Ouagadougou could now run his online shop without bleeding profits to Microsoft. A women's cooperative in Dakar selling shea butter to Europe could safeguard its customer lists without fearing surveillance, and young coders in Nairobi, often forced to use pirated tools, now had legal, affordable platforms to develop apps that spoke to African needs. The sense of empowerment was palpable. In Lagos tech hubs reported record attendance as entrepreneurs rushed to explore AfroCloud services. In Accra, university students held seminars titled "Owning Our Digital Future." Across social media, the phrase data sovereignty became a household term no longer confined to policy experts. For the first time, ordinary Africans felt the abstract world of cloud computing had a direct liberating effect on their lives. Politically, the consequences were even more profound. AfroCloud became a symbol of legitimacy for governments that had long struggled to prove their independence from Western influence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, already hailed as a bold reformer, emerged as the face of digital liberation. His decision to move all government records into AfroCloud within 90 days was seen not just as a technical reform, but as an act of defiance against centuries of external control. Other leaders quickly followed. Mali and Niger issued decrees requiring all state agencies to migrate to AfroCloud by year's end. South Africa and Kenya announced joint investments to expand server capacity. Even countries historically cautious about challenging the West, like Ghana and Senegal, began signaling support. AfroCloud had become more than a technology, it was a political declaration, a rallying point for sovereignty. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Opposition figures in some countries warned of centralization, questioning whether governments might use AfroCloud to tighten surveillance over citizens. Civil society groups demanded transparency in how the servers would be managed and who would control encryption keys. These debates underscored a central paradox. While AfroCloud broke foreign domination, it also placed immense power in the hands of domestic states. Internationally, tensions escalated. Washington hinted at sanctions, suggesting that AfroCloud might be compromised by Russian or Chinese backing. European officials warned that African nations risked losing access to European Union digital markets if data rules diverged too sharply. The African Union, however, stood firm, framing AfroCloud as a continental project that belonged to no single nation, but to Africa as a whole. Meanwhile, the symbolic power of the change reverberated in cultural and spiritual life. Church sermons and Friday prayers alike invoked AfroCloud as a modern-day exodus from digital slavery. Community leaders in rural Burkina Faso, who once struggled to explain why young people's social media messages passed through distant American servers, now spoke proudly of Africa bringing its children's words back home. Perhaps the most striking consequence was generational. To older Africans, AfroCloud was vindication, a long-awaited chance to reclaim something denied since colonialism. To the youth, it was a challenge to build, innovate, and guard this fragile independence against both foreign and domestic threats. By the end of the first month, it was clear AfroCloud was no longer just a cloud. It was a storm, and its civil and political consequences had only just begun. From the outside looking in, the AfroCloud revolution was not just an African affair. It landed like a thunderclap in Washington, Brussels, and every global capital where digital dominance had long been taken for granted. The United States in particular saw the development as both a business disaster and a geopolitical alarm bell. In Washington, lawmakers held closed-door hearings within hours of Microsoft's collapse in Africa. Intelligence officials warned that the United States had lost a critical foothold in the fastest-growing digital market on Earth. This isn't just about profits, one senator declared. It's about losing visibility into a continent that holds strategic minerals, military partners, and a rising population of 2 billion. AfroCloud, they argued, was not a neutral innovation. It was a shield against Western oversight. The Pentagon worried aloud about the security implications. If African governments stored sensitive data on AfroCloud, what would happen to U.S. counterterrorism, partnerships, satellite coordination, or even embassy communications? In the past, much of this information flowed through American servers, offering both protection and quietly a measure of control. That door had just slammed shut. The European Union's reaction was more cautious, but no less concerned. Brussels urged dialogue with African partners, framing AfroCloud as a potential violation of international digital trade rules. European tech companies, many of which relied on Azure contracts in Africa, lobbied fiercely for protective measures. For them, AfroCloud was not just competition, it was an existential threat to their market share. By contrast, Beijing and Moscow wasted no time capitalizing on the moment. Chinese state media portrayed AfroCloud as proof that the age of Western digital imperialism is ending. Russia's foreign ministry went further, offering cybersecurity assistance and promising to help African nations resist any foreign sabotage. Both nations positioned themselves as allies of Africa's sovereignty, hoping to convert goodwill into long-term partnerships. For ordinary Americans, the story trickled down through headlines that framed the event in different tones. Some newspapers described it as a betrayal, Africa turning its back on the West after decades of aid and investment. Others presented it as a warning: if Africa could break free of Microsoft, what would stop Asia or Latin America from doing the same? Analysts compared it to the oil shocks of the 1970s, a sudden reminder that power can shift overnight, leaving the mighty scrambling. Beyond governments and corporations, global civil society also weighed in. Digital rights activists in Europe and the U.S. applauded AfroCloud, calling it a blueprint for resisting monopolies. African diaspora communities in New York, London, and Paris celebrated in the streets, waving flags and posting messages of pride on social media. For them, it was more than a tech story. It was a milestone in the long struggle for dignity. Still, uncertainty hung in the air. Would AfroCloud's infrastructure withstand cyber attacks from powerful adversaries? Would Africa's governments use their new sovereignty responsibly, or would it become another tool of internal oppression? The world watched with fascination and unease, realizing that the map of digital power had been redrawn, and not by Washington, Beijing, or Brussels, but by Africa itself. The story of AfroCloud is not merely about servers, contracts, or stock prices. It is about something far greater: the reclamation of power in a world where digital space is the new frontier of sovereignty. For Africa, the fall of Microsoft's empire on its soil was more than a financial transaction. It was a declaration that the continent will no longer be defined by dependency. Yet history warns us that every revolution invites retaliation. In the corridors of Washington and Brussels, strategies are already being drawn: sanctions, cyber operations, diplomatic pressure, all designed to weaken AfroCloud before it becomes irreversible. The question is not if the pushback will come, but when and how hard. That is why this moment should not be viewed as an ending, but as a fragile beginning. AfroCloud represents opportunity, but also responsibility. African leaders must ensure transparency, protect civil liberties, and guard against corruption. Without that, what began as liberation could slide into new forms of control. And for ordinary citizens, vigilance is just as important as celebration. The ripple effects are global. If Africa can stand up to Microsoft, who will be next? Could Asia, Latin America, or even parts of Europe begin demanding their own digital independence? Could this be the first domino in the collapse of big tech's unchallenged dominance? For some, that thought is terrifying. For others, it is the hope of a more balanced world. And for the United States, this moment should serve as a wake-up call. If Africa, long dismissed as a consumer market, can chart its own digital path, then Washington must ask itself, are we listening to the aspirations of sovereign nations, or are we clinging to an outdated empire of code and contracts? The final image lingers, a darkened server room, once bathed in Microsoft's blue light, now glowing with the green, gold, and red of AfroCloud. It is a reminder that power shifts quietly until suddenly the whole world feels the quake. So I ask you, the viewer, do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's digital sovereignty strategies are truly effective, or is this just the first chapter in a longer struggle? Can we continue to trust him to lead this revolution, or should another step in to carry the torch? Please share this video if you feel you are one of the first to witness and support this historic transformation. And subscribe if you believe that Africa's truth is far more important than the headlines Silicon Valley wants you to see.